Before we begin, breathe slowly and remember this. What you are about to hear is not a story, but a mirror. Once these words enter your mind, you may never see yourself, or the people around you, the same way again. If you are ready to step into the shadows Jung warned us about, then stay. But know this, awareness comes with a price. Darkness begins not with the absence of light, but with a fracture in meaning. In every society, in every family, in every soul, there exists a hidden force that does not build, but corrodes. Statistics tell us that nearly 1 in 5 individuals will, in their lifetime, meet someone who leaves behind not only scars of betrayal, but ruins of entire social circles. These are not merely difficult personalities. They are embodiments of something older than language, something that has haunted humanity since the first fire was lit. They are the carriers of an ancient psychological virus, the archetype. It begins subtly, a laugh that carries poison, a gesture that unsettles without reason, a silence that suffocates a room. And yet those who stand close to such a figure often feel the inexplicable pull of fascination. Like moths drawn to a flame, they step closer to the very force that will consume them. For the archetype of chaos does not reveal itself with horns and smoke, but with charm, with a mirror, polished to reflect our own shadows. In my years of observation, I once encountered a patient whose presence infected the very air of my office. She was elegant, articulate, even captivating. But when she spoke, the words bent like branches under the weight of an unseen storm. Her narratives were tangled, her laughter too sharp, her pauses too long. I could smell a faint perfume of lilacs, but beneath it, the odor of something rotten lingered, not in the air, but in the atmosphere of the psyche itself. As she told me about her relationship, I realized each connection ended in devastation. Friendships disintegrated, families split, even communities fractured, and yet she always walked away untouched, as if she were the eye of a hurricane. This was not madness in the medical sense. This was the archetype of chaos, breathing through her veins. Modern science, though it cloaks itself in the language of rationality, has begun to circle this abyss. Neuroscience has mapped the amygdala, showing us how fear hijacks the body, but there is no scan for the infection of meaning, no laboratory test. Cognitive psychology of dark triad, Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, yet these are only surface. Beneath them is the timeless current that Jung himself recognized, the archetypal pattern that repeats across centuries, cultures, and myths. Chaos personified, walking in flesh. The ancients were not blind to this. In the Gnostic texts, there is mention of archons, entities whose only task was to cloud the human mind. In Hindu philosophy, one meets Kali, the goddess who both destroys and renews, reminding us that chaos is not an intruder, but a structural necessity of existence. The Greeks whispered of Eris, goddess of strife, whose single apple could plunge kingdoms into war. These were not fairy tales. They were warnings encoded as myth about what happens when chaos takes human form and begins to manipulate the fragile threads of order. How does one recognize it? Imagine sitting at a table with friends, laughter, then someone says a single phrase, not violent, obscene, and suddenly the warmth drains from the room. A subtle unease creeps in. People shift in their chairs. Eyes avoid one another. It is as if the atmosphere has been poisoned, though no one can explain why. This is one of the first signs. The distortion of emotional climates, the invisible hand that alters mood. The carrier of chaos does not need to scream. They only need to tilt reality a few degrees, and others will stumble. At first, it manifests in whispered suspicion, small lies, a smile that conceals venom. Then it grows bolder. Alliances form and collapse under their influence. Truth itself becomes unstable. Stories shift. Facts blur. The very ground of shared meaning begins to tremble. By the time you realize what is happening, you are already inside the labyrinth, and the way out has been erased behind you. But this is not merely a personal danger. Chaos is infectious. It spreads through relationship, through workplaces, through entire nations. History itself bears the scars of leaders who embodied this archetype, figures whose charisma concealed destruction, whose promises carried within them the seed of collapse. When the archetype of chaos rises unchecked, civilizations descend into nightmares and individuals are swallowed whole. There is, however, one defense: consciousness. To see is to resist. To name the shadow is to weaken it. But consciousness demands courage, the courage to confront not only the chaos outside, but the chaos within. For the most terrifying revelation is this: the archetype of chaos is not only embodied by others, it lives dormant in each of us, waiting, watching, hungry. The question is not whether you will encounter it. You already have. The question is, will you recognize it before it devours the order you cling to? A door creaks in the corridors of the mind. Behind it lies a territory that most never dare to explore, for it is not filled with light. The archetype of chaos does not announce it's a storm crashing against the shore. It seeps through, invisible, almost tender, until its presence is undeniable. To understand it is to stare at the blueprint of collapse, a forbidden map that reveals how fragile the architecture of order truly is. When I speak of the archetype of chaos, I do not speak of disorder in the banal sense, a messy desk, a scattered routine. I speak of a psychic force that corrodes coherence itself. Imagine a mirror that once reflected your face clearly. Then, slowly, the glass darkens, smudges spread like ink, and soon you're left with only fragments. This is the experience of those who fall into the orbit of chaos, the gradual disintegration of identity, the erosion of certainty, the terrifying sense that the ground beneath them no longer belongs. I recall a man who came to me in his late 30s, voice, his demeanor polite, but his life was an open battlefield. Every partnership had ended in conflict, every business venture in scandal, every intimate bond in devastation. It is as if misfortune follows me, with a half-smile that chilled the air. Yet as he spoke, I realized he was not merely pursued by chaos. He was its vessel. Those around him seemed to wither, their hopes splintering like dry wood. And still he believed himself innocent, untouched, a spectator of a storm that he himself summoned. His laughter echoed long after he left the room, a haunting reminder that chaos rarely recognizes its own reflection. Modern research has begun to trace faint outlines of this map. Neuroscientists from Cambridge speak of mirror neurons hijacked by pathological personalities, showing that emotional climates can indeed be infected like viruses. Social psychologists describe emotional contagion, the way moods ripple across groups. Yet what science names in cautious terms, myth spoke of with blazing clarity: possession. The ancients knew that one spirit could inhabit many, and that a single dissonant soul could fracture an entire tribe. The scriptures, too, echo. The Bible tells of Legion, the man inhabited by many demons, whose chaos spread fear across his village. The Buddhist texts speak of Mara, the tempter who clouds clarity and entangles seekers in illusions. Even Plato, in his dialogues, described how disorder in the soul spreads to disorder in the polis, as if the same poison, once ingested, cannot help but spill outward. The archetype of chaos has always been known. We have simply renamed it with sterile vocabulary, disguising the terror of ancient wisdom behind academic phrases. How does one see the first signs of this map unfolding? They are subtle, like footsteps on marble floor. At first, there is the distortion of time. In the presence of the chaotic, minutes stretch into hours, silences grow unbearable, days collapse into fog. Then comes the distortion of truth. Conversations once clear become riddled with contradiction, promises evaporate, memories are rewritten, as if reality itself bends to their narrative. Finally, there is the distortion of self. The victim begins to doubt their own instincts, their own senses. The mirror is shattered, and they no longer know which fragments belong to them. The progression is relentless. First, unease, then disorientation, then dependency. By the time the final stage arrives, devastation, the victim is so entangled in the web that escape feels impossible. The archetype of chaos thrives not by brute force, but by corrosion, by erasing certainty, until surrender seems like the only path. This is why entire groups succumb together, families spiral into cycles of betrayal, workplaces dissolve into paranoia. Nations drift into hysteria under the spell of leaders who embody this archetype. Psychologists today might call it collective delusion or mass psychosis, but the ancients called it possession by a dark god. And indeed, when one studies the patterns, the result is the same. Reason collapses, emotion rules, and the crowd marches willingly into destruction. But here lies the secret Jung taught me through his writings and his silence. Every archetype lives within us. The archetype of chaos is not merely out there, waiting in others. It sleeps in the unconscious of each individual, waiting for conditions to awaken it. A moment of deep fear, a trauma unintegrated, a desire for control disguised as vulnerability. Under pressure, the archetype stirs, and suddenly one finds oneself not as the victim, but as the carrier. The line between the infected and the infector is thinner than we wish to believe. This is why recognition matters. Awareness becomes the torch in the labyrinth. To see the signs in others is to protect oneself. To see them in oneself is to reclaim the fragments before they shatter beyond repair. But this requires brutal honesty, for the ego resists admitting its own capacity for chaos. We prefer to believe that destruction comes from without, from strangers, from enemies. Yet the forbidden map shows otherwise. The gate is always inside. And so I warn you, as Jung would warn, study the archetype of chaos not as distant folklore, but as a reflection of your own shadow. For the map is not drawn on parchment or stone. It is inscribed in your nervous system, in your ancestral memory, in the silence of your own dreams. Those who deny this truth will always be the first to be consumed. The archetype of chaos never arrives naked. It comes clothed in masks, subtle and alluring, often indistinguishable from charm. To mistake the mask for the person is to step willingly into a trap from which escape becomes a trial of the soul. The first lesson of chaos is that it does not conquer by brute force, but by seduction. Like a serpent coiled around the branches of paradise, it speaks in half-truths, in whispers that sound almost like your own voice. I remember a woman who spoke to me as though every syllable was dipped in honey. Her eyes shimmered, her words caressed, and yet something behind her disturbingly hot. As she recounted her childhood, the stories shifted each time, details rearranged like furniture in a dream. When I pressed her, she smiled, a smile so perfect it was terrifying. It was not the smile of joy or even deceit. It was the smile of absence, an echo, a reflection with no origin. I knew then that I was in the presence of chaos, wearing its most dangerous costume, the human mask of normality. Neuroscience today offers fragments of explanation. The study of psychopathy shows how some brains register no empathy, no echo of the suffering of others. Functional MRI scans reveal silences where compassion should ignite. Yet science, for all its instruments, cannot measure the chill of that smile, the suffocating quiet of a presence that feels less human than it appears. Jung would have called it possession by an archetype, the psyche eclipsed by a force older than time. Ancient traditions recognized this phenomenon. The shamans of Siberia spoke of spirits that could hollow out a person, leaving behind a shell that imitated life but radiated disruption. In Christian mysticism, the angel of light is described as one who dazzles with beauty while leading souls into ruin. Even the Egyptians warned of Set, the god of chaos and violence, who wore the face of a trickster. Across cultures, the warning remains, beware the smiling mask, for it conceals the abyss. The signs reveal themselves slowly, like cracks spreading across glass. At first, conversations feel intoxicating, as though you are in the presence of brilliance. Then, contradictions begin to surface. Stories do not align. Promises shift. You find yourself questioning your memory. This is the first stage of the mask, confusion. The second stage is dependence. The chaotic figure makes you believe they are your only anchor, the one who truly understands you. Finally comes the stage of devastation when the mask slips and the chaos beneath erupts, leaving ruin. By then, you are already trapped in the wreckage. Consider how entire groups fall prey to such masks. Charismatic leaders rise in times of uncertainty, their words intoxicate, magnetic. Crowds chant, families divide, nations tremble. The collective is seduced by the mask, unaware that the archetype behind it has already entered their bloodstream. Jung warned that the unconscious, when denied, manifests not only in individuals, but in whole societies. What begins as a single smile can ignite revolutions of terror. And yet the most unsettling truth is that the mask does not belong only to others. Each of us wears it at times unknowingly. We present faces of kindness while hiding our envy. We speak of truth while bending it for our own advantage. We smile when inside we despise. In these moments we feel the archetype stir within, whispering through our own jest. The mask becomes not only their weapon, but ours. The clinical stories confirm this. A young man once confessed to me that he could make anyone believe he loved them. He tested this ability in relationships, in friendships, even in professional life, a game. But in the emptiness of his confession, I saw the greater tragedy. He was already lost to the very mask. The mask had devoured the face. Modern psychology calls this persona, a necessary adaptation to society. But when the persona fuses with the archetype of chaos, it ceases to be a tool and becomes a... The person no longer wears the mask wears them. How then can we protect ourselves? By recognizing the weight of silence, by noticing the moments when words glisten too perfectly, when gazes linger too long, when smiles appear detached from feeling, by trusting the unease that stirs in the gut, the primitive alarm system that whispers, something here is not what it seems. For intuition, though often dismissed by reason, is the psyche's oldest defense. But awareness comes with a price. To see the mask in another is to acknowledge the possibility of the mask in oneself, and that is the most terrifying recognition of all. The enemy outside is never as dangerous as the traitor within. So remember, when the mask smiles back, do not answer with your own smile. Answer with consciousness, for only the light of awareness can pierce the hollow gaze of chaos. Every descent begins with a whisper. The archetype of chaos does not explode into the psyche like thunder. It seeps, it drips, it erodes. The danger lies not in the sudden catastrophe, but in the slow unraveling that feels at first almost imperceptible. By the time one recognizes the pattern, the labyrinth has... Imagine a candle flickering in a silent chamber. At first, the shadows are played almost. Then they lengthen, twist, and soon the entire room is swallowed by distortion. This is how chaos operates, through stages as predictable as a ritual sacrifice. Jung taught us that archetypes are not random. They unfold in sequences, patterns written into the bones of our collective psyche. And the archetype of chaos, so terrifying, obeys its own dark lit. The first stage is seduction, begins innocent, a word spoken with unusual intensity, a glance that feels like recognition in a desert of indifference. Victims describe this stage as intoxicating, as if they had finally been seen. But this is the bait, the hook concealed beneath velvet. The carrier of chaos offers exactly what the soul longs for: validation, attention, meaning. And like moths fluttering toward a glow, we move closer, blind to the fire hidden within. The second stage is contamination, subtle distortions. A story shifts in small details. A truth bends. A silence grows heavier. Those entangled begin to doubt themselves. Did I mishear? Understand? In reality, the ground beneath them is already trembling. The archetype of chaos infects perception itself, bending not only the story told, but the listener's very sense of reality. This is the essence of gaslighting, described clinically, but far older than the term itself. It is the manipulation of meaning, the contamination of trust. The third stage is isolation. Friends drift away, families fracture, support networks crumble. The chaotic figure creates rifts where once there were bonds, replacing them with dependency on themselves. The victim, now destabilized, clings to the very presence that destroys them. It is a paradox as old as myth. The prisoner embraces the jailer. Neuroscience shows us that under stress, the brain's oxytocin pathways can bind even to abusers, a cruel twist of biology that enslaves through attachment. Science explains, but mythology had already warned. Persephone taken into the underworld, bound not only by force but by the taste of forbidden fruit. The fourth stage is devastation. Masks fall, promises shatter. The full face of chaos emerges, no longer disguised by charm. Here, the destruction is no longer subtle, but absolute. Reputations burn, health collapses, sanity teeters. Some describe it as being swallowed by quicksand. The harder they struggle, the deeper they sink. Entire groups caught in this stage spiral into collective hysteria, each member echoing the other's madness, until reason itself becomes impossible. Finally comes the fifth stage, possession. By now, the victim is not merely damaged. They are transformed. Their speech changes. Their values corrode. Their eyes mirror the very emptiness that once terrified. They have become vessels through which chaos, carriers of the infection, spreading the same fractures, destroyed them. It is here that the archetype completes its cycle, birthing new agents of disorder to infiltrate new circles. This is why chaos never remains isolated. It multiplies generation after generation, as if it were a living organism feeding on humans. Consider history, the rise of cults, the intoxication of crowds, the madness of regimes. They all follow this same sequence. First, seduction by a leader's charisma, then contamination of truth with propaganda, isolation from dissenters, devastation in the form of violence and collapse, and finally, possession, when entire populations begin to embody the madness themselves. It is not mere politics. It is archetypal possession on a massive scale. Ancient texts whispered of this cycle with chilling precision. The Greeks called it hubris leading to nemesis, arrogance leading to ruin. The book of Revelation spoke of Babylon's seductions before her catastrophic fall. In Hindu cosmology, the yugas describe ages of rising disorder until the world collapses into chaos, only to be reborn. These myths are not metaphors. They are maps of recurring patterns, carved into the human unconscious like grooves in stone. But the most disturbing revelation is this. The cycle can begin in the smallest of moments, a single unresolved conflict in a family, a subtle lie in a friendship, a manipulative gesture in a workplace. The stages do not require armies or nations. They only need a doorway in the human heart. From there, chaos builds like a storm, feeding on silence, denial, and fear. And yet, knowledge of the stages is already a weapon. To see seduction as seduction, to name contamination as contamination, is to interrupt the ritual. Consciousness acts as salt on the wound of chaos, slowing its spread. But vigilance must be constant, for the archetype is patient. It waits for weakness, for fatigue, for the moment when one says, perhaps this time it is different. That is always the moment it strikes hardest. So beware the escalation. Beware the candle whose flame seems harmless, for it is only the beginning of the inferno. Beware the smile too perfect, the silence too heavy, the story that shifts like mist, for these are not accidents. They are the stages of a pattern older than history, the steps of a dance that ends always in the same abyss. And remember, once possession takes root, the cost of reclaiming oneself is not merely effort. It is rebirth through fire. Few emerge unscathed, fewer still emerge at all. A single spark can burn a forest, a single lie can fracture a family, and a single individual possessed by the archetype of chaos can infect entire communities with a madness that no fire brigade of reason can extinguish. What begins in whispers within one soul does not stay confined. It spills outward as if reality itself cannot contain the infection, for chaos, once awakened, craves expansion. I have seen this in the intimate theater of family. A father whose mood shifted like storms poisoned the atmosphere of his home. His wife moved like a ghost through the... His children learned to read the barometer of his son. A slammed door became thunder. A prolonged silence became light. In time, the entire household breathed to the rhythm of his disorder. He no longer needed to shout. His presence alone dictated the weather of every room. Here, chaos became not a private torment, but a collective climate, swallowing innocence, rewriting childhood into a labyrinth of fear. Neuroscience confirms what myth has always suggested. Emotions spread like... Researchers call it emotional contagion, the invisible current that makes a group laugh or tremble in unison. When the carrier of chaos enters, their distortion becomes the group's distortion. Memories align with their manipulations, reality bends around their moods, and soon the collective no longer knows where truth ends and illusion begins. In psychological terms, this is group gaslight. In Jungian, it is possession, not of one individual, but of an entire network of souls. History groans beneath the weight of these patterns. Consider the madness of witch hunts, when villages became inflamed by suspicion, neighbors turning against one another, with eyes blazing from a fire that had no visible source. Consider the rise of fascist regimes, where entire populations seduced, contaminated, isolated, devastated, and finally possessed. The same sequence I described before does not stop at the threshold of the individual. It escalates into the bloodstream of nations. Crowds chant, rationality dissolves, and people commit atrocities not because they are monsters, but because they have been swallowed by an archetype older than civilization itself. The ancients, though lacking laboratories, were not naive. They described such phenomena with symbols modern ears call myth. In Norse sagas, Loki whispers lies that fracture the halls of Asgard, turning gods against each other. In Greek tragedy, the Erinyes, the Furies, rise when blood crimes go unatoned, driving entire families into cycles of revenge. In Christian scripture, the phrase principalities and powers names forces beyond flesh that rule societies through distortion. These are not fairy tales. They are encoded warnings of collective infection of chaos. What does it look like in the present day? A workplace where one manipulative figure slowly turns colleagues against each other until paranoia becomes the new norm. A family where one sibling's lies corrode trust so thoroughly that even acts of kindness are met with suspicion. An online community spiraling into hysteria, convinced of distortion, amplifying them until millions believe what was once unthinkable. These are not isolated events. They are collective possessions in miniature, rehearsals for the larger tragedies that stain our history books, and the signs are always the same. First, a shift in atmosphere. Laughter fades, suspicion grows, trust evaporates. Then, a distortion of truth. Facts blur, narratives contradict, memory becomes unreliable. Finally, escalation. Groups turn inward, devouring themselves, or outward, seeking enemies to justify their disintegration. What began as one person's chaos has metastasized into a social cancer. But Jung would remind us the collective is only the sum of individuals. Chaos can spread only because each member carries within them a dormant resonance to the archetype. A society collapses because the shadows within its citizens align with the greater shadow pressing from without. The carrier may ignite the fire, but it is the dry tinder of unconsciousness that allows it to rage unchecked. There is no greater danger than this, when chaos cloaks itself as virtue, when the collective begins to believe that its madness is justice, its hysteria is righteousness, its cruelty is necessity. Then the archetype has fully possessed not only the group, but the very narrative by which the group justifies its action. In that moment, consciousness becomes treason, and those who resist are branded enemies of the new order. This is why chaos spreads with such terrifying speed. It does not only infect minds, it infects meaning itself. So how can one resist when the collective has already been consumed? One cannot stop the tide by standing on the shore. The only weapon is inner clarity, the refusal to allow one's own psyche to be rewritten by the group's distortion. Jung spoke of individuation as the highest calling, to remain whole when the collective. It is a lonely path, for it often means standing against the madness of crowds. But it is the only path that preserves the torch of order through the long night of chaos, and the night will come. For the archetype of chaos is not a question of if, but when. It is woven into the cycles of history, the rise and fall of empires, the bloom and wither of families. To recognize its collective form is not to escape it, but to prepare. Preparation, in this case, is not building walls or storing weapons. It is sharpening consciousness until it cuts through distortion like a blade through fog. The horror is not merely that chaos spreads. The horror is that we welcome it, invite it, even worship it, when it promises meaning in times of fear. Entire generations have fallen because they mistook destruction for salvation, and unless vigilance is constant, the pattern will repeat. So ask yourself, when the crowd chants, when the family fractures, when the workplace trembles under invisible weight, will you see the archetype at work, or will you become its instrument? For in the collective theater of chaos, every soul must decide whether to join the chorus of madness or to hold silence. There are storms that announce themselves with thunder and storms that arrive in silence. The archetype of chaos belongs to the second. It does not kick down the door of the psyche. It seeps through cracks, rearranging the furniture of meaning until the room no longer resembles itself. By the time most notice, the tempest is already inside. Yet there are signs, subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, but as distinct as smoke before fire. To ignore them is to invite ruin. The first sign is the distortion of atmosphere. Have you ever sat among friends, laughter flowing like wine, only to feel a sudden chill crawl across the table? No words were spoken, yet the mood shifted. Smiles became strained, voices faltered, eyes darted away, the air thickened, nothing visible. This is the first whisper of chaos, the ability to bend emotional climates without uttering a command. Jung once described such moments as the intrusion of the shadow, a psychic presence that unsettles not through action, but through resonance. The second sign is contradiction without consequence. The chaotic figure tells one story today and another tomorrow, each version conflicting with the last, and yet no one dares confront it. Instead, those around them begin to adjust their memories, bending their own perception to fit the shifting narrative. Reality itself begins to feel unstable. Modern psychology calls this cognitive dissonance. Ancient wisdom called it enchantment. For what else is it but a spell when minds betray themselves to protect a lie? The third sign is the smile that does not match the eyes, a look too polished, too rehearsed, devoid of warmth. It is not cruelty that chills, but the vacancy behind the gesture. Neuroscientists speak of micro-expressions, the fleeting signs of hidden emotions. But the archetype of chaos does not merely slip, it displays. Its smiles are masked, and masks always leak silence. To sit across from such a gaze is to feel the primitive alarm in your gut, the animal instinct whispering, danger. The fourth sign is isolation disguised as intimacy. The chaotic figure draws you in, convinces you that you are uniquely understood, specially but slowly. Others fade from your orbit. Friends are painted as untrustworthy. Family is suffocated. Colleagues as envious. What feels like closeness is actually a... By the time you notice, your world has narrowed to a single gravitational center, the very presence that is dismantling you. This is not love. It is entrapment masquerading as connection. The fifth sign is time bending into fog. Days blur, hours stretch. Silences linger longer than they should. In the presence of chaos, time itself feels unstable, as though the ordinary rhythm of life has been disrupted. Victims often describe it as living in a dream, or worse, in a nightmare. The ancients called it enchantment. Jung would call it possession by... Today, science measures it as stress on the nervous system, but the lived experience is the disorientation. And then comes the most dangerous sign of all, silence that kills. Not every it is loud. Sometimes chaos operates by withholding, by letting silence spread like poison through a relationship, a group, or a society. Questions are met with stares. Doubts are left unanswered. The absence of clarity becomes its own weapon. In this silence, fear multiplies. People begin to speak less, think less, act less, until the very space of life shrinks into paralysis. The terrifying truth that these signs rarely appear in sequence. They interlace, they overlap, creating a web so subtle that by the time one notices, the pattern is complete. Worse, the human instinct is to dismiss them. Perhaps I'm imagining things. Perhaps it's nothing. But the psyche knows, the gut knows, the body knows. Ignoring these whispers is the first step toward devastation. Across history, prophets, mystics, and philosophers have warned of these signs. The Taoists spoke of imbalance in the flow of qi. The Stoics warned of corrupted logos. The Desert Fathers of early Christianity described the noonday demon, the creeping distortion that drained vitality without a sound. All spoke of the same reality. Before chaos erupts into fire, it always sends smoke. But here lies the cruel paradox. Those most vulnerable to chaos are precisely those passionate, too forgiving, too willing to explain away. The strong often but deny, the weak often sense but obey. And thus, chaos thrives in the cracks of our virtue, feeding on kindness, exploiting loyalty, weaponizing love. So what must one do? First, to believe the uneasy. Intuition is not superstition. It is the wisdom of countless ancestors encoded in your nervous system. Second, to name the distortion. Words are weapons against the fog. To say, "This is not right," is to light a torch in the labyrinth. And finally, to act with hesitation. For once chaos is recognized, every delay strengthens it. The warning signs are not warnings only. They are invitations to consciousness. But consciousness requires courage. The courage to see what others refuse to speak when silence dominates, to walk away when gravity pulls you deeper. Most will not choose this path. They will stay, hoping the smile will warm, the contradictions, the silence will. But hope, in the hands of chaos, is a leash. So I tell you this, if the air chills without reason, if truth bends like a reed, if eyes shine without warmth, if silence weighs like stone, do not wait for proof. Proof comes too late. By the time the fire is visible, you are already burning. When standing before the archetype of reason alone is a fragile weapon, logic dissolves in the fog of distortion. Kindness becomes even love itself is twisted. To survive such an encounter, one must adopt not the tools of comfort, but the instruments of war. This is not a war of swords and guns, but of symbols, of meanings, of the soul itself. The protocol of protection is not optional. It is the thin line between preservation and ruin. The first rule is awareness as armor. To see is to resist. Chaos thrives only in blindness, in the fog of denial. The moment you name it, its power begins to weaken. This is why tyrants despise truth, why manipulators hate questions, why abusers fear exposure. To bring light into shadow is to pierce the spell. Awareness must be cultivated like a daily ritual. Keep journals, track conversation, observe the subtle document what the fog seeks to erase. Consciousness, once sharpened, cuts through illusion like a blade through silk. The second rule is limit as chaos tests boundaries relentless, probing for cracks. It asks small favors, twists small rules, demands small compromises, until suddenly the walls have collapsed. The antidote is immediate and absolute limit setting. Say no without apology. End conversations when distortion arises. Withdraw your energy when your presence is weaponized. This is not cruelty, it is survival. Jung spoke of individuation as the process of drawing the circle of the self. To defend that circle is not selfish. It is the only way to preserve the core from dissolution. The third rule is retreat as strategy. Do not mistake endurance for victory. To stay in proximity to chaos is to allow infection. The longer one remains, the deeper the entanglement. Sometimes survival means not confrontation, but departure. Withdraw strategically, like a soldier leaving occupied territory. Group. Ancient wisdom echoes. The desert fathers fled cities possessed by corruption to preserve their souls in silence. The samurai spoke of strategic withdrawal as a higher art than reckless bravery. To retreat from chaos is not cowardice. It is the discipline of self-preservation. The fourth rule is silence as weapon. Chaos feeds on reaction, anger, confusion, fear. Each response is a rope it uses to bind you tighter. Deny it this fuel. Do not explain endlessly. Do not defend every word. Do not justify already knows. Hold silence not as surrender, but as shield. In silence, chaos flails, deprived of the oxygen of. In silence, you reclaim control of your breath, your heartbeat, your narrative. The fifth rule is community as fortress. Isolation, the favorite terrain. Alone, the victim doubts their senses. Together, witnesses restore reality. Share what you see with trusted allies. Speak the signs aloud. Build a circle where truth is spoken with distortion. History shows us this truth. Those who resist collective chaos are never solitary figures, but networks of consciousness. The underground churches under dictatorships, the resistance movements under tyranny, support groups under abuse, all drew strength not from one hero, but from collective vigilance. Modern science confirms what the ancients intuited. Studies on resilience show that individuals connected to strong social bonds recover faster from trauma, resist manipulation, and rebuild meaning after devastation. The nervous system itself regulates in the presence of trusted others. The fortress is not only metaphorical, it is biological. Connection restores order. But above all rules, there is one principle: consciousness as shield and sword. Jung wrote that the only true defense against archetypal possession is the awakening of the self, the integration of shadow, the relentless confrontation with one's own darkness. For what we deny in ourselves, we will always meet in others. The person who cannot face their inner chaos will forever fall victim to external carriers of it. The final protection is therefore not only outer vigilance, but inner work, to descend into one's own abyss, to face the serpents coiled there, and to emerge holding not denial, but integration. Only then can one stand before chaos without trembling. Spiritual traditions echo this same truth. The Christian mystics spoke of the armor of God not as metal, but as clarity of soul. The Buddhists taught mindfulness as shield, the ability to see thought as thought, illusion as illusion. The Stoics armed themselves with logos, the disciplined clarity that could withstand madness. All paths converge on the same revelation. The greatest fortress is consciousness itself. And yet, let us not romanticize this battle. To enact this protocol is not easy. It demands vigilance so sharp it cuts comfort. It demands solitude when the crowd chants madness. It demands courage to name lies when everyone else bows. It demands humility to admit that chaos lives not only outside, but inside, and that the line between the two is never absolute. Still, without this protocol, the fate is always the same: erosion of meaning, corrosion of self, collapse into possession. Those who walk unarmed into chaos do not return the same. Some do not return at all. So hear this as warning and instruction. Cultivate awareness as armor. Hold boundaries as shields. Retreat when needed. Wield silence as weapon, and anchor yourself in community. Above all, sharpen consciousness until it becomes the sword that chaos cannot dull. For in this war, there is no neutrality. To ignore the protocol is to surrender. And when the moment comes, it surely will. When the smile hides venom, when the silence weighs like stone, when the crowd chants what you know is madness, you'll stand, perhaps trembling, perhaps wounded, but standing nonetheless. And in that stance, fragile yet unbroken, you will discover the greatest secret of all. The archetype of chaos may consume many, but it cannot consume the one who refuses to abandon the light of awareness. There is a moment when survival is no longer enough, when one has named the signs, set the boundaries, withdrawn from the battlefield, and yet still feels the whisper of chaos in the marrow. For the truth is this: you cannot escape what you carry within. The archetype of chaos is not only the face of the other, it is the reflection in the mirror that trembles when the lights, and to deny this is to live forever vulnerable. Jung warned us that what we repress returns. The shadow is not erased by denial, it festers. The archetype of chaos, then, is not only an enemy to be resisted, but a part of the psyche to be confronted. This is the most terrifying revelation. The battlefield is within. The father who poisons his household, the tyrant who seduces nations, the manipulator who shatters trust, each is a distorted echo of something already sleeping inside each of. The abyss is not out there. It is here, behind the curtain of our carefully polished personas. I once treated a patient who insisted she was a victim of chaos everywhere she went. Friends betrayed her, partners abandoned her, workplaces collapsed around her, and yet, as she spoke, I saw the pattern. She herself carried chaos in every gesture, in every omission, in every silence heavy with accusation. She could not see, for her shadow had been banished to the cellar of her soul. But the banished shadow rules more absolutely than the acknowledged one. Her tragedy was not that she encountered chaos, Her tragedy was that she embodied it without knowing. Modern neuroscience supports this ancient intuition. Studies on trauma show that unresolved wounds distort perception, priming the brain to recreate the very disaster it fears. Victims of abandonment may unconsciously sabotage intimacy. Survivors of betrayal may see deception where none exists, and, in their suspicion, create it. In this way, chaos is both external invader and internal echo. The past, unintegrated, becomes a ghost that rearranges the present. The ancients encoded this truth in myth. In the Greek tale of Oedipus, the hero flees to avoid his fate, only to run directly into it. In Christian theology, the figure of Satan is not only the external tempter, but the adversary within, the rebellion etched into every soul. In Buddhism, Mara does not arrive with armies, but with illusions projected from the seeker's own mind. The abyss is universal, and it always carries the same message. What you refuse to face within, you will encounter without. To confront the archetype of chaos, then, one must descend into the labyrinth of the shadow. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a lived initiation. It means to sit with one's envy, one's rage, one's capacity for cruelty, without fleeing, without excusing, disguising. It means to admit, I too am capable of distorting truth. I too am capable of poisoning the atmosphere. I too wear masks that smile while my heart corrodes. Such admissions burn, but they also live, for what is acknowledged can be integrated, and what is integrated no longer possesses. But here lies the paradox. The descent is both peril and salvation. Many who enter the abyss never return whole. Some drown in self-loathing, mistaking confrontation for condemnation. Others are seduced by the very chaos they sought to resist, embracing power without conscience, control without compassion. To enter the shadow is to walk the razor's edge. Only those who carry the torch of consciousness, unwavering, can return with treasures rather than scars. The treasure, however, is not power, it is clarity. To know one's own capacity for chaos is to resist it in others without naivety. The man who knows his own envy cannot be easily manipulated by flattery. The woman who knows her own rage cannot be seduced by false promises of righteous fury. Integration transforms the individual from victim to witness, from pawn to player. It does not erase chaos, but places it in context within the larger symphony of the psyche. Philosophy has long circled this revelation. Heraclitus declared that strife is justice, that order is born from tension. The Taoists spoke of yin and yang, chaos and order interwoven, each birthing the other. Even Christianity, with its apocalyptic visions, frames destruction as precursor to renewal. The archetype of chaos is not simply evil, it is necessary. Without the serpent there is no awakening. Without the storm, no shelter is built. Without the abyss, no light is sought. But necessity does not mean surrender. One does not invite chaos to dinner simply because it sharpens awareness. One does not embrace destruction as friend because it teaches resilience. To integrate the shadow is not to celebrate it. It is to acknowledge its presence, to respect its power, and to refuse its dominance. Chaos may be eternal, but so too is consciousness. The dance is unending, but the dancer may choose the steps. And yet, let me speak with brutal honesty. Few choose rightly. Most deny their shadows until they are consumed by them. Most project chaos outward, blaming others, nations, fate, while carrying the infection in their own veins. The result is history repeating itself with grotesque precision. Wars ignited by fear, families broken by secrets, souls fractured by denial. Humanity's greatest weakness is not ignorance of chaos, but refusal to admit that it dwells within. So when you ask, how do I defeat the archetype of chaos? Understand the truth. You do not defeat it. You confront it. You integrate it. You walk alongside it without letting it steer the wheel. You become conscious enough to recognize its whispers in your own voice, its hunger in your own desires, and in that recognition you are no longer prisoner, no longer pawn. You are, at last, awake. But awakening comes at a cost. The abyss, once seen, never disappears. The mirror, once darkened, never returns to innocence. The eyes that have stared into the shadow cannot forget the hollow that stared back. This is the price of conscious, to carry the knowledge of chaos forever, like a scar etched into the soul. And yet, it is the only path worth walking, for to deny the shadow is to be devoured by it. To confront it is to walk with trembling dignity, fragile yet unbroken, through a world where chaos waits at every corner. History is not a straight line. It is a wheel, spinning endlessly between order and chaos, creation and destruction, birth and decay. Civilizations, like individuals, are not immune to the archetype of chaos. They too are seduced, contaminated, isolated, devastated, and finally possessed. The difference is only scale. Where one person's descent shatters a family, an empire's descent shatters the world. And if one listens closely, beneath the noise of politics and war, one hears the same archetypal whisper. The cycle demands repetition. Consider Rome. The Republic, once built on discipline and law, slowly gave way to indulgence, corruption, and betrayal. Senators plotted, citizens craved spectacle over substance, emperors rose like gods while rot consumed the foundations. Rome did not fall in a single day. It decayed under the slow poison of chaos. The signs were there: distortion of truth through propaganda, isolation of dissenters, the silencing of conscience, and then collapse. Or look to Weimar Germany, a society humiliated, fractured, yearning for meaning. Into that vacuum stepped a figure who embodied the archetype of chaos, cloaked in charisma, offering order while sowing ruin. The sequence unfolded with brutal precision: seduction by promises, contamination of truth, isolation of enemies, devastation of conscience, and possession of a nation. What followed was not merely politics. It was archetypal possession on a collective scale, with consequences etched into humanity's nightmares. The ancients knew this cycle well. The Hindus described the yugas, cosmic ages spiraling from golden order into dark collapse, only to begin anew. The Greeks spoke of the ages of man, descending from gold to silver to bronze to iron, each era more chaotic than the last, until the world is purified, fire, and reborn. Even the Bible tells of recurring floods, destructions, and apocalypses, each a cleansing of corruption. These myths are not primitive fantasies. They are collective memories, encoded into culture, warnings carved into the very soul of humanity. Chaos will come, again and again. Modern science, too, hints at the same rhythm. Sociologists note the rise and fall cycles of civilizations, a pattern of growth, excess, crisis, and collapse. Psychologists trace how unintegrated trauma resurfaces generation after generation, repeating the same family dysfunction. Even physics whispers of entropy, the universe's inevitable drift toward disorder. Order is never permanent. It is borrowed time. Chaos waits, patient, until the walls crack. But what is most terrifying is not that civilizations fall. It is that they do so willingly. People embrace the archetype of chaos when it offers them meaning, when it promises simplicity, when it feeds their hunger for certainty in uncertain times. They drink poison because it tastes sweet in the moment of despair, and thus entire nations march into their own destruction with songs on them, convinced they are walking toward salvation. Look around today, and the same patterns shimmer beneath the surface. Distrust in institutions, truth fractured into countless competing realities, families torn apart by ideology, communities intoxicated by outrage, technology amplifying distortion faster than the psyche can comprehend. These are not accidents, they are signals. The wheel is turning again, and chaos is hungry. Philosophers across ages have warned of this inevitability. Nietzsche spoke of eternal recurrence, the endless repetition of the same pattern. Spengler wrote of civilizations as living organisms, each destined to bloom and wither. Jung himself warned that what is not faced in the individual will erupt in the collective, that the denial of shadow breeds monsters not only in dreams, but in parliaments and armies. And indeed, we see the archetype of chaos never dies. It reincarnates, wearing new names, new languages, new masks, but always with the same hunger. Yet amidst the horror lies a strength. For collapse is not only an ending, it is also a clearing, a necessary devastation that makes renewal possible. The forest must burn for new seeds to take root. The temple must crumble for new rituals to emerge. The psyche shatter for new consciousness. This is why chaos has never been. It is woven into the very process of evolution, both personal and collective. But let us not romanticize fire. To speak of collapse as renewal is to risk forgetting the suffering it brings. Families destroyed, lives consumed, cultures erased. Renewal comes, but it comes drenched in blood and ashes. To invoke chaos lightly is to misunderstand its cruelty. The archetype of chaos is not a gentle teacher, it is a devourer, and it extracts a price from every soul it touches. So where does that leave us? Suspended in paradox. Chaos is both enemy and necessity, destroyer and midwife, shadow and seed. To fear it absolutely is paralysis. To embrace it blindly is suicide. The only path is awareness, to recognize the cycle, to see the signs, to resist the seduction, and yet to accept that collapse, when it comes, is part of a greater rhythm that transcends individuals and empires alike. And so the question becomes, when the wheel turns again, when the archetype of chaos rises in your family, your community, your nation, will you be devoured unconsciously, or will you stand conscious in the fire, aware of what is unfolding, carrying the torch of meaning through the ruins? For collapse will come. History promises it. Myth confirms it. Science whispers it. The only unknown is how you will meet it, as victim, as carrier, or as witness. In the end, there is only silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence when the ruins of meaning lie scattered like bones across a... The archetype of chaos has no true conclusion, for it is not a story, but a cycle, not an intruder, but a companion that walks with humanity through every age. To study it is not to banish it, to name it is not to kill it. The most one can do is to hold awareness like a trembling flame in the vast night, knowing the wind will always return to test its strength. You must understand the archetype of chaos is not evil in the childish sense, a villain to be defeated once and for all. It is older than good and evil. It is the raw storm from which morality itself emerged, the abyss against which the soul carves its fragile lines of order. Without it, there would be no need for laws, no hunger for gods, no pursuit of meaning. Chaos is the dark womb of creation, and yet, when it erupts unchecked, it devours the very children it births. This paradox is the essence of the human condition, to live between order and chaos, to be torn between the light consciousness and the gravity. When I close my eyes, I hear the voices of the ancient, the Greek tragedians whisper of nemesis, the inevitable correction that follows arrogance. The Hindu seers describe Kali dancing on the corpses of illusion, fierce and holy at once. The mystics of Christianity warn of the Antichrist, not as a figure of horns, but as the distortion of truth so seductive that even the faithful are deceived. Across all traditions, the message converges. Chaos will wear a mask of beauty, speak with a voice of reason, and enter with the silence of a shadow, and only those who see with more than eyes will recognize it. Modern science, cautious language, has circled the same abyss. Entropy is inevitable. Systems collapse. Meaning, once fractured, rarely restores itself without intervention. Psychologists warn of cognitive distortions, sociologists of mass hysteria, neuroscientists of fear, circuits hijacked beyond reason, and yet, beneath their measurements, the same truth hums. The archetype of chaos is alive, not in the supernatural sense, but as a pattern that repeats through brains, families, societies, and epochs. Science does not contradict myth. It confirms it in colder terms. And so, what remains? Not immunity, not victory, only vigilance. Awareness must become a ritual, consciousness a discipline, courage a companion. Must look for the sign, the silence the smile that conceals, the story that shifts. You must act when others withdraw, when others cling, speak when others fall silent, and most of all, confront your own shadow. For the enemy within is always more dangerous than the enemy, but even this is not enough. For the archetype of chaos is eternal, and the best we can hope is not to destroy it, but to dance with it without losing ourselves, to live in awareness that order is fragile, that meaning is temporary, that the abyss waits at every step, and yet to live anyway, to build temples knowing they will fall, to love knowing betrayal is possible, to speak truth knowing distortion will rise. Consciousness is not a guarantee of safety. It is a guarantee of dignity. In this sense, the final defense is courage, the courage to carry light into places where light is mocked, the courage to remain human when the collective has surrendered to hysteria, the courage to admit one's own darkness and still choose not to. Few possess this courage. Most will bow, will obey, will vanish into the chorus of. But for those few who stand, trembling yet unbroken, the archetype of us cannot claim victory. And so, I leave you with this. The archetype of chaos is not a monster you can kill. It is a mirror you must face. In that mirror, you will see the abyss, the smile without warmth, the silence without meaning. But if you dare to hold its gaze, to admit its reflection in your own eyes, then you have already begun to transform it. For the abyss, once named, loses its monopoly on fear. Beware, then, the forgotten archetype that pulls all into ruin. Beware the whispers in the air, the fractures in the story, the chill in the atmosphere. Beware the chaos outside, and even more, the chaos within. But do not despair, for though the shadow is eternal, so too is the light of consciousness. And even in the deepest night, a single flame is enough to defy the darkness. The storm will come again, the wheel will turn, the mask will smile, the silence will spread, and when it does, you must remember, to see is to name is to resist, to stand is preserve the fragile. This is the only command, the only shield, the only legacy worth leaving, for in the end, the archetype of chaos is not defeated by armies or kings, by science or myth, by prophets. It is defeated, if only for a moment, by the solitary act of that refuses to collapse. And that in a universe built on cycles of ruin is the most radical act of all.